Hi, Irene. How are you? We'll wait a couple minutes.
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thanks. So how's your job going? Good?
Good. I just started today. It's just my orientation and the beginning of my training.
At the city?
Yeah, at the city of Moreno Valley. It's at the city hall.
Okay, good. I'm glad. I'm glad you got the position there. Jarrell's here now. Hi, Jarrell. How are you? So let's check out our assignment and your notes for today. And then we'll touch on some example. Then we can we will do a lab later this week on Wednesday. Let me share screen. Okay, good to know that you're doing well. Are we competing? Are you, Irene and Jarrell, are you guys doing NCL or? I've been trying to get vouchers.
Is it too late to apply?
Well, so I've been sending it the last couple of weeks for them to pay. I haven't heard back, but yeah, you can still check with Cynthia. I know that as soon as I get some of the vouchers, it's, you know, I'll share with Cynthia and everybody. So if you wanted to compete, you can, or
Okay.
I'll email you. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, good. I know that this weekend on Saturday, they're doing California Mayor's Cup. I thought that it was in April, but they moved it to March. It's like right before the NCL. So I think we're gonna not do the California Mayor's Cup. There are 3 teams from college that's competing. I know Chafee is competing, RCC is competing, and College in the Desert is competing. So when I met with them last Friday, they mentioned that they moved it. It's free. Let me put the link in for you. Hold on one second. If you want to compete, but it's on Saturday all morning. So if you like to, here's the link for the California Mayor's Cup. It's free. They asked me, but I said it's kind of late and I don't like to, but if you guys still want to do it, they open it, I think, for a few weeks now. So all right, it's 5 o'clock. Hi, Michelle. We are gonna go ahead and get started. I think last week when we did the web server, it's a good segue into this week. So today I'm gonna focus on looking at a couple of the modules, or a few modules and then one package. We're gonna take a look at how we're gonna program that in Python, mostly because part of cybersecurity is you have to be able to assess websites and applications. So this is going to give you some details on how you're going to be able to read the headers and some of the content of the actual HTTP. Let me share screen now. And sorry. Okay. So this week we're going to work on HTTP programming, and this is part of chapter 4. In the lab, we'll focus more on using RESTful API, but for the assignment today, we're going to touch on how to be able to write really short, sweet program. Some of the program will be able to read files, and then some of the program will be able to download. So whatever you can do via the browser, you can actually do it through the script itself, and be able to get the response and the requests that you need. So sorry for the late upload of the notes. I just finished my 27 class and I was trying to squeeze in time to be able to do that. So you should be able to see this file. So when you're using HTTP, when you're connecting with your web server, as we saw in the lab last week, that you can use a browser to be able to use Get HTTP 1.0. Now, with Python, if you're using a library or a module, you can do the same thing. And some of you have seen this in CIS30E or another class. But for this class, we're interested in working with how we're going to be able to set up the communication. So when you connecting to a website, the client is going to send a request to the server. The server is going to provide the resources and respond. Now, as it responds, you're going to see that there's going to be different status code. So when you visit a website that has an error, it's not available, you're going to get a 404. So on the client side, you're going to get a status code. Now, sometimes when you have server, on the server side, you're also going to get a status code. So we might have a redirection or internal redirection. So 500 is going to give you the server error. Okay. Now, when the response is sent from the client to the server, the information that's going to come back is going to be in some headers information. And because HTTP is stateless, and so therefore the protocol, the process in that, it doesn't really store anything. The only information that's being exchanged is stored to two things. Your cookies, which most of you know, right? It stores values on the client side. So as I'm using a website on my system, usually require cookies. And now most company would use cookies to be able to learn a little bit more about the user activities. And then on the server side, there's a temporary memory location that is used to store what's called, we know as sessions. And so these sessions are just entailing transactions on the server side. And sessions can be, you know, a lot of different things, where if we're looking at security, somebody can hijack a session, somebody can also poison a cookie. So there are many ways to really perform an attack using these two elements. So now coming back to the assignment, not the 27 assignment, sorry. I just came out of my class, so let me come back to the 30 assignment. I thought I had opened it. Okay. For question number 1, it asks you, describe how cookies and sessions are used in HTTP information exchange between the client and the server. So as it mentioned in the notes and the textbook, your HTTP is a protocol that is stateless, right? And even though we're able to generate status code, it's only going to happen when there are client and server client and server communication. So cookies are stored on the client system, and it's used to store values for that communication on the client side. The session are memory storage that is used to store transaction, what the server provides as far as resources to the client. So these are the two elements that essentially used in the exchange of the information between the client and the server. Now, in the last week, we talked about socket and how socket is important to establish connection for different protocols. We talked about using TCP versus UDP. And in HTTP, that will be under the umbrella of TCP, we need to be able to establish a socket. Now, using Python to do that, you are using high-level type of socket compared to more on the machine level that will be lower level socket, right? So we are using high level socket to be able to establish client server connection. And the high level socket would then be modified or interpreted via the interpreter to be able to give you what you see as a low level connection via that socket. So when you program in Python, you must create a socket, right, for the client and a socket for the server. And we touched on that last week. Okay, so for number 2, we can put down that will be sockets. And on the first page, it gives you some of the status codes, and your status codes could include errors. It could also include that everything is connected okay, or things are being redirected. So when you have redirection of website, you would be able to have the appropriate status code. Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so when you have a client error, for example, when we get a 404, that's a client error. And when you have like the 501 or the 500 type of status code, that would be for the server error. So in some of our program that we're going to see today, we're going to take a look at our status code, and that's how we're going to be able to see that it served the resources for that web page as we connect it to that domain. Okay. So now when you submit a request from the client, your server would then return the code that's going to give you the output on what you've seen as web pages. So in the last lab, we talked about how it could use index file to be able to give you the web page that you need. You can also add additional HTML file, or you can write scripts to be able to have more interaction with the user. And the request, it uses the headers to include the information on what it needs. And so when the server responds, the server is going to respond, and we can see a lot of that via the headers. Okay. Now, when you're creating the client, how you can connect to a domain is you're going to use a module or a library called HTTP client. Last week, we used a different type of module. We use socket module, which establishes socket, and we can still get the connection. And this week, we're going to see that we can use HTTP client, and that allows us to access the method that was integrated along with the class HTTP connection. And this is going to give us a way to connect to a certain domain. So when you look at this script, you simply import in the module, and you're going to create an object. And in this case, we're going to call it connection. And for this object, we are going to use the library of the module and its class, which is HTTP connection, to be able to connect with google.com. So when you're using your browser, this is what's happening in the back, right? That it needs to connect to the domain. Now on the client side, we need to issue a get command. And this is how it's able to retrieve, or after it's connect, to be able to get the content or the resource from the web server. Now, once you submit the request, you need to be able to have a way to store the response. So our second object is going to be response, and we are going to use the get response method. So that's going to return some information about what that server is providing. We want to print out what type of response that is. And in order to print the status code, right, whether you're connecting or you're having an error, you simply use the property, which is status, right, of the response method. So you simply print out the property, and also another property is called reason. So in the case where if we have an error, let's say 400, we would be able to identify what kind of error it is through the reason property. The next part in this example one is that it's going to give you the if statement. So if your status is 200, that means it connects fine. then it's going to read the data. So we want to use the read method to be able to find out what kind of data it's giving us. So just like how we talked about the protocol itself, it needs to be connected. Once it's connected, it's going to submit a GET, right? And then the server is going to respond. So it's going to serve the content. And what we want to see is we want to see the content as data here. Okay. So let me see. Let me open up my example 1. So this is the code that we see on our notes. And let me clear this out real quick. So you can simply run it in Tawny or idle, that's fine. So here we can see that when we connect to google.com, right, it initialized that and it established a connection and it went through and it checked the condition. So once it's connected, it was able to connect okay. So we get a 200 status. And then here it gives us the detail about, you know, the type of data that's going to serve us from the content. So if you click on this, it just simply show your HTML file that which is your data that was received, okay, from the response. Okay, so this is how we can connect to a domain as a client, an HTTP, right, a client, and we're able to print out the status. So using this example, and you can also find the code in your notes. We would be able to create number 4. Okay, so in this example, we want to use the HTTP client module similar to example 1. We want to submit our request to youtube.com and we want to return the status and the data. And you simply want to provide the screen capture of your script and your code, and then also, or your script and your output. And then we want to be able to identify what kind of status the website is giving us. So let me open up my size 4. So I use example 1 as a template, and I simply change my domain information. You can also, you know, add in what you want to print. So here, let's clear and rerun this. Okay. Now, if I'm simply using youtube.com and this is an HTTP, right? It tells me that it's now moved permanently. So they had transitioned to HTTPS. And so the server tells me that I'm getting a 301. It's internally redirected. Okay. So now, unlike the other one where all the content is coming back, I don't have the data because it checked false for this condition, right? Because I'm receiving a 301. So as my status is different than 200, I'm not going to get any kind of content. And the only time that you're going to get data is when the server respond okay, right? Like you establish the connection and everything is okay. So the only time that we're going to get the 200 is when we're going to get data. So unlike the example, I don't have any kind of data here. And I want to show you using this, right? But if you replace this with another domain, let's say if we can use like, you know, google.com or, you know, microsoft.com or something like that, you're going to get some content for the data. Any question? Okay, so use example 1, and you can also look at the documentation. And here, these bullets are intended for you to kind of give you a little bit of background on what that program is implementing. We talked about how HTTP connection is a class, and you brought that in by importing in the HTTP client module. When you're using the get response method, it gives you the instance from that class. So your object is going to store the information, the data, and the response and metadata from what it was requested. And we would use a read method in order to read the resource data. Okay, so that would be what we see in example 1. Any question? I see a chat. What would be the error in this code to cause 500, the server error? Yeah, so if the server is unavailable, Michelle, like let's say if it's down or it's not able to locate, then you would get the 500 on the server side. Now on the client side, we're only going to see 100, 200, 300, 400, right? On the server side, if it's not able to connect, then you would get a server error. Could be 501 or something like that. Okay. All right. Other questions? So the second type of library that we're going to use a URL Lib Request Package. And in this package, it has many modules, so you can use specific modules, but we can import in the entire package to be able to work with requests a little bit more. So extension to this, right? We saw that we can use HTTP client, but this is a way that we can look at the specific in the request process for HTTP. The module that you would see is going to be URL lib, and this allows you to access things like files, images, directories, and so on. Okay, so I can download an image file from that particular website. I can also access some of the content, such as pages on that website. I can also go through the folders or the directories. And part of the web assessment is that you have to traverse through the folder or look at the directories on what that would be inside the content of the directory. So this library or the module along with the package is going to be very useful. Now, we need to also encode, as some of the content will be in raw data or in bytes. So in order for us to really read the data and put it into text, we need to make sure that we're either using ASCII encoding or UTF-8 encoding in order to be able to get information. So what if I wanted to add content to the website, like posting a comment or uploading a file, right? And that is part of the process in HTTP. In that first is that when you visit a website, you use a GET. And if you're responding to the web server and you want to be able to add a file or add some type of text, you can use what's called the post command. Okay, so in example two is a way that we can add in, right, the ID number to a website, which is the bin org. Okay. And as you look at this, first, we are importing in the request from the URL lib package. Second, we need to parse it. Okay, so we got a request and then parse. Okay, so parse is the second module. We declare a dictionary, and this dictionary have the key and the value, and the key is ID, and the value is just numerical. And you want to put that into quotation mark. Now, the data, as we said, that it could be just in bytes, so we need to use a parse. Okay, and we want to parse that with the dictionary. Then we would encode that with ASCII. Now, once we have that established, we would then use the URL open method to be able to connect to that domain and add in the content, which is post. And we want to get the response from the server and read the response. But as you implement the read method here, you need to decode it to UTF-8, otherwise it will throw an error or you will not be able to see what that would be. So for us, we can understand text output by decoding that. Because as we encode up here, we need to decode down here. Okay, so we have to reverse it so that way we can see it. So in example 2, that's our script. And the second part is the post. So you are going to get more details in this, right? It's going to take this and it's going to add it to the bin org. Okay. And every website is a little different. So if you try that for another website, as most of the time they control how the data would be input. So for example, if you're using google.com, it will not work in this form because Google is gonna require, number one, it's also HTTPS, and the field that you enter your text is a little different. So you have to think about how you would be able to approach this with, you know, those websites that you can add in text or file or things like that, like pastebin, right? Bin type of website works really well for here. Now in the output, you would see that it will show the IP, the domain, the fully qualified domain name, and then also it can be parsed into JSON, and we will see some of that, okay? Because as the content of this can be pretty lengthy, so we can put this into JSON format. So in the next exercise, we are going to use example 2. And example 2 uses URL lib.request package and your URL lib parse module. Now, I want you to post text data. You can put any string to pastebin. And pastebin is a way that we can, you know, copy and paste the text in there and it temporarily store it for us, right? And then we can use a browser, let's say on another computer, to be able to pull what we paste in the pastebin. And we want to display the response and the status. Okay, so that's objective. These are the objective for number 5. We just have to implement the package like the example and the module. We want to post some form of text data to the domain and then get its response and status. So now let's take a look at number 5. So at the top, I would have the module, the package, and then the module. Originally, let me remove this. I wanted to do something with JSON there, but I'll just have this as output regularly, like example 2. And for the dictionary, I wanted to use a key called test. And then also for my value, it was simply CIS30C test. Now, in some case, when you're using this with, for example, with, file servers or some form of servers that require some authentication, right? You would have to implement API authentication before you'll be able to execute this to really get the headers and the information. Okay. So we would then have the URL and we can run. So as you look through this, quite a few pieces of information that's coming back. Okay. So you do get some HTML content that's going to come back. And then as you look at the HTML, these are some of the pieces that could be their advertisement, and or that could link to other things like what you see with Facebook and Twitter. Now, this is why the textbook said, oh, well, what are we going to do with all of this output? We can probably put it into JSON format and be able to read it, and it will be a little cleaner as it would come out. Okay. Any question? So in this one, we simply implement a container that stores the type of data that we want to put onto the website itself. Okay. Now, when you're dealing with injection, right? So injection can be written in a script like this. Okay. You probably heard of URL injection. You probably heard of like just using a form. So anytime that we have a text field area, we can input some kind of data, right? Now, on the other side, the developer would have to have some kind of input validation. So definitely here, we can add in the type of things that we want to add to that website. So script can be used in a wide variety on what you want to do with that injection. And I'm not talking about SQL injection. That's would be that you would put in the SQL series queries, right? The criteria for the queries inside some kind of container, and then you would add it. Now, URL stuffing or URL injection is that now because of the new browser, it scrambles your URL. But back in the day when we're using like Internet Explorer and things like that, people would then have the script to be able to inject right into the URL or modify the content of the actual website for defacement and so on. So from a security perspective, yes, this simple code is just to connect to a site, add some content to it, and then be done with. But we have to look at from a security viewpoint where how that can be used, that can, impact our organization if that's going to be facing the public. Okay. So this would be for number 5. Any question? And you can put any data in that, right, on how you would use that. So in the case where you would have username and password, or like an FTP site where it would connect via the HTTP, the web server, right? It would ask for some form of, ID or authentication. So we can implement API and we can authenticate. Once it's established the session, then we can add in the script to be able to add content to it. Okay. All right. So below that, it explains, right, what the URL open method does. basically that would send and receive response from the source. So it would send from the client and then receive the response from the server. And then without the request, the Lib Request Package, right? If we're looking at the method itself, it is an instance from the HTTP response class. So therefore, we're able to have this. Okay. Now, the author suggested that you can run this into in the shell where you can import in JSON and then write a statement to have it, timeout, and then also read everything and load everything into JSON. But you have to do this individually in shell, or if you want to incorporate this into the code, you got to make sure that, it works with your existing script or code. Any question? Okay, so for number 3, that's what it's showing. You can use JSON, and here we would then need to import JSON. And again, we're using the same package. So you have an object called URL because you're going to be able to pass this, right, into our open method, URL open. As when you visit the site, you would issue a get command. So we would want to put in the URL and then /get. And we want our response to be in JSON. Okay. Now we have to be able to decode this and then print it to show. So if you want further information, you can visit the link for JSON module and how to integrate JSON. Any question? Okay, so we don't have to use example 3 or do anything with that. That's just showing you how to do that. As you've seen them through the prior example as well. Okay, where you would implement the module and you can add in JSON module to process format your output in JSON. Okay, let's look at number 4 before we do number 6 in our assignment. So here it talks about how when you're submitting a request, right, the server is going to give you the response and that would be stored in the headers. So there are 2 parts in the request. You have the header and the body. And the header is important because it contains the information that's exchanged between the client and the server. So we can use getHeaders method to be able to access headers property. So in example 4, we would start with our package that we import in. Then we are going to import in request, part of that package. And we would specify, right, what our URL would be. So here you have an object that's going to hold the URL or your domain information. Now, the next line is very important. So you want it to be compatible and it needs to be able to provide the resources to all different types of browser. So we got the Linux, which is Mozilla, right? Apple WebKit, which incorporate your browser for Apple. Here it talks about KHTML like Gecko, and then you have Chrome. So after that, we would have a function called Chrome User Agent. and we have an object called opener, we would then use the package and the method called build opener. Then we're going to add in the headers by using add headers method. It's going to be your user agent. And then we would install the opener. Now, since we have the opener, we want to be able to use URL open, and then we want to access that domain. So it's going to come back to what you have declared as, and we want to print out the response header. Okay. Here in the for loop, we would then use response header to be able to obtain the header and the value. So coming back here in the assignment, it says for number 6, it tells you to refer to example 4, exercise 6, use example 4. We're going to use the package URL lib request. And we want to access resources from our server, our web server, Microsoft.com. Now, in the output, it's going to give you a lot of information, including, right, what is going to be your access control methods like get, post, and so on. And it also going to talk about, or we have to answer the question, what type of information can be found about the cookies after we output from the response from the server. So for number 6, here you go. So we would have our URL that's different from the example. We would use the Microsoft.com, and we would use the user agent about the same. So any question with example 4 or the exercise 6? So when we run this, we would have a lot of details, right? So after it lists some of the information specific to a certain vendor like Microsoft and Apple, it's going to talk about the type of access control allow methods. Okay, so you have head, get, post, patch, put, and options. And that's part of your question. It accepted the encoding, and we would have a timestamp. So after this, we would see that it produced the information about the cookie and the session value. Okay. So that would take care of one of the questions from that exercise. Now the header part is where it's going to give us the response information. So you would have the header that's being requested with the user agent. And also here we would have request header items. Okay. And it lists some of the bullets on how you would use that. So your opener object contains properties, and you need to access that property, okay? Because we don't want to make a bunch of different objects. We want to be able to store some of the details about the specific object and then bring that in for our display. So let me open number 6. Sorry, to the different one. That one. Any question regarding 6? Use 4 as a template. Now, by the end of this course, we should be able to understand and know how to do this, right? Without having to use the code snippet or the code that came with the text. Any question? Now, can you see anything on the cookies after you run number 6? You sure can. So if let me move this up a little bit so you can see. Here, where you would see some cookie information, right? Along with connections and encoding and so on. Lots and lots of information. So here, that's how it's able to establish the cookie. Then also the features on those cookies. Okay, so make sure we answer number 6. So there are a lot more things that we can do with this particular package, URL lib.request. Okay. In a longer script, what we can do is we can use it to open. So you would create the opener. Okay. And then this is going to allow it to work with different browser. And for the install, we would then simply bring in the opener. Example 5. Or example 5. So here we're able to get some information about the mail, and you would see that. Let me run that for you. Okay, let's open this. Example 5. So here we go. So this program in example 5 is a little different than the other one where we would have some interaction with the user, right? Again, we're using URL lib.request. Here is a regular expression, and regular expression allows us to look for these characters. So that's why we have to import in RE. We simply create an object called URL, and we would store what the user input as URL. We create an opener, and we would pass user agent and also user agent, which is where we specify the type of browser that we have. And lastly, we would have the content to read the content. And then when we compile, it's going to seek those. Okay. So if I put in Nike.com, and this might be like a little bit. So you do see that how it can identify, right? Based on the information that you give it, right? The type of email that would be linked to that group. Okay. All right. Any question? Okay, let's take a look at the next example so we can see how to do number 7. And example 7 is a little bit more lengthy, right? Here we're using the request package, but below that we would use the error module from URL-lib. Now this one is a little different than the prior in that it would have a exception handling. So we would write try and accept. And in the case that it generates error, we want to print out the error and the reason for it. Otherwise, we want for it to read the file and then split up the content. Okay. And this is a textbook example. Okay, so there's a function. Inside the function, we would nest the exception handling statement. We have file response as the object, and this is going to be URL lib request and opener. And it's going to print that out. So the content will be what it read, and we want to return and split it so that way it makes more sense to the user. Okay. So when I ran number 7, you can see that it's giving me a 406 error. Any question? Okay, let's look at the assignment. So for number 7, it tells you to use example 6. We are going to download an image file. So you can use Unsplash or any kind of file or server that has some kind of image file that you can download for free. Okay. So first I need to visit a website that I want to download from. Okay, so Unsplash is this. And I can, in a regular download, I would click either the category, I can select the picture and be able to download it. Okay. But I wanted to test a download first and also see some file information on what it's saving as a file name. So here we want to visit the site. We're going to select the image and download it. And we're going to look at the property of that image to be able to allow it to connect to Unsplash directly and give us a screenshot. Sorry, I accidentally clicked this. Here's my 7. So once I visit the website, let's say I wanted to get this picture, right? Some of them are free and some of them are not free. So we want the free ones. Then once I download the picture, I will be able to see the full file name with its extension. And that's important because unless you change up your file name information, then you need to, if you customize it that way, you need to make sure that you align your Python script with how the file is named. Okay. So I simply import in the package and I tell it that it's going to begin the download process for my picture. I put in the URL and notice that here, the extension to the URL is how it's going to be able to locate that file. And we would tell it to retrieve from URL, which is this one. And then again, down here, once we downloaded the file, right, we want to tell the user that the status of the download and the image that's downloaded. Now, importantly, your file name information with its file extension needs to go there in the parameter of the retrieve. Now, if you don't put the correct name in the file extension as, you know, from that website, it's not going to be able to pull it. So what I did was I downloaded the picture. I looked at the property of that picture to get the full file name. And then I put in the appropriate URL where that picture is found. So once it downloaded the image, I wanted to read it. Okay. So I would put in the file name as a parameter inside that read method. And I wanted to be able to see that. Yes, so you can use any extension that would be, you know, so in the case that if it's HTML, the way it reads it is that it would read it like how you would open it up in the browser. Okay. So read is just a way to view it. So if I run this, let me clear this so you can see. I didn't have it to do too much. It just, it shows me that it started to download, very similar to the example. It shows me the status because we told it to give us the response status right here, right? That it was okay. And you can do exception handling here if you want. And then it told me that it downloaded the image. Okay. So you can try as image file like PNG, JPEG works. So this is a quick way that we can download image file. It's like you search through and click that picture or right click it and, you know, choose download. So this is a way that you can do it in Python. Any question? So as long as your image is on a public page, Cynthia. So let's say that if you're using like, you know, one of those, Unsplash is people upload it on there to share. But if you're using like those image website where you would put your picture up for people to grab, yeah, as long as you have it on a website and linked to a website, you would be able to download your own. As long if the Google photo is public, yes. Yeah, you can use those photo websites as long as your image and that link is publicly accessible. I choose to use Unsplash because it's, you know, I know Canvas, when I put pictures and image on your page, yeah, that pulls from Unsplash. Now, some of these cost and some of them are free, right? So if you visit the site and you don't find I try to put, because here's the free one, you can just search for the free, and then you can choose like the category that you want. So like nature, and then I think it shows one of the bridge picture. This one, this is the one that I downloaded. This is this is in Washington State. And sometime when it gets cold, the spring, it freezes. You can see it's just like ice. I hiked through there's another bridge section on the other side, and you can view like the springs on the other side. Okay. So you can choose the type of image or the site that you want to use, as long as it's publicly accessible and you're able to get the property information of that image to make sure that you have the right name. That's what's important. All right. Okay. So in the later example, you know, after they show you how to extract email, you can also create a Python script to count the word in the text file. Okay. Like example 7 here. It uses also URL lib request. Here you bring in the error module. You write a function, and then we want to handle the exception with that. It's going to go through and it's going to read. You have an object that's going to store, right, the properties as it opens that website. And in the case where we're running to error, we want to use it with the exception. So except, else, we're going to have it read the content of the file. So I don't know if I have it open because oh, here's the count. Now, the example in the text, it uses like this website. So if the file doesn't exist, it's going to handle that with the exception, right? It says HTTPS not exist. And when you do this, you can use like text formatted file, but PDF does not work. I just tried with, because PDF uses Adobe application or some kind of application to be able to view it. It cannot be viewed with the native OS tools. So it would not work well. Okay. So like .txt is good. So if we run this, it's going to tell you that it is an error because it's not acceptable, right? So if this file doesn't exist, or if there's anything wrong with the URL, right, it's gonna go here. But if you have a valid URL with the appropriate extension for the file on that URL, then it should be able to give you the content of that file. You can have it read. So for exercise 8, you simply just refer to the example 7 and you want to write the script to download. So I think for this one, the longest part is to be able to find like a public text file that you can, because not a lot of online website, unless like those advertisement website where you can download some free templates and things like that. So you have to find a website that would have some kind of text and then just point to that and be able to have it download the file, read the file, and be able to give you the content. Now, if there's not a valid website that you can find, it's still going to be able to run okay. It's just going to handle the exception as long as you're using a .txt. Okay. I'll show you. I tested it with different file format. Let me open up mine so you can see. I tried to have it read some of the documents from NIST. Okay. So this is the DOI from NIST. That's where they keep all their repository for their documentation. And I try to make it read the 800-13, which is IoT security, right? And if I run this, let me clear this, it's going to throw an error. Okay. Because it's not able to, it got through for some part, and then it's not able to read the rest of the PDF because it's not in a regular text format. You know that PDF, like I said, require application to be able to access it, just like how Microsoft Word require Microsoft Word or doc require Microsoft Word. So therefore, it's not able to take the content and give you this, give you the read, and it couldn't split up the text. Okay, so that's why the data, it's gonna time out, and it's not able to parse it. Okay. And then also, if you're using a website that requires authentication, and then after that will be download, it would not let you, of course, it would just handle that with the exception. So in my case here, as you can see, right, it got to like a certain part and then it's not able to serve the request with the data along with read the data. Okay, so for number 8, we simply just use example 7 and be able to integrate that. So as you can see, we can do a lot with URL lib and other type of module. And then I'll expand on the next module, and then we'll talk more in the lab. So request module, this was also covered in advanced Python and other classes. So as you know, this plays into RESTful or REST API quite a bit. So similarly, you're able to still achieve the same thing using request module. But request module also allows you to use API, and it has quite a few advantages. Okay, so that's the example. If you integrate this with the HTTP client, this is going to give you the methods and the feature, right? That is a little bit more than what you've seen in the URL lib or the other module. As it is not native to the Python standard library, you have to install it using pip3, or you need to install it in your IDE, right? You got to bring in the module. So we would need to manage the module. So if you use it for the first time in Tiny, right, or your IDE, you would just need to manage the package or install it, okay? Now, if you're using directly with command line, then you can do the pip3 install. And if you don't have pip, you got to install pip. In most cases, people would use the Python virtual environment. So once that's activated, they just, they just incorporate that through the console or the command line. And additional things that mentioned here, that it is a way that we can incorporate all the operations, and it simplified the scripting process for us. It reduces the number of line of codes that you have to use. And for web connection to, if we're doing this for HTTP connection to the web server, we can use it to post data in forms. Like I said before, right? Any kind of form that you type in, that's a form of post. We can use it to handle cookies and so much more. And so as we use it for the different form of operation, we have to think about how those type of operation will play into what we would see with security. Okay. All right. Any question? Oh, there's one more check from cookies from being altered. So your cookies is stored at the location depending on the browser, right? But ultimately it's in the directory. So a lot of us controlling it through the browser as an application, or you can control it at the permission level. But also when you visit the website, right, it asks you but they're required to prompt you that you allow them to store a cookie or not. And that simply is just a file for them to kind of, just store the details about the communication between you and the web server. You can always remove the cookies and then after you use it, but yeah, most website nowadays uses cookies, or you can control the permission with the cookies. Deleting the cookies also take away some of the things that, for it to cache, that was cached from that particular website. So it just saves time and resources ultimately. Yeah. So how they when cookies are modified, right, they simply just modify the content of the cookies, or even access the cookies. Cookies are used in forensic quite a bit to really look at, what resources people are accessing. And when you do web investigation, you usually just look at a few things, right? The favorites, the cookies, the session information, and so on. And so that way you can paint the picture on what they were doing on the web. Okay, so in the case where if there's a crime that's related to their web activities, you can definitely conduct an investigation for the web activities. Now, in the back, when you start writing these scripts, you're going to see that all of these are just, it relies on methods and operations, right? So far, the things that we talked about in these modules, and it's kind of relaying across, is that you're always going to have some kind of request coming through. And we know that with HTTP. And we're always going to have some kind of response for coming back. And in the response, it's going to give you some kind of status and the data, okay? And also that's could be included in the headers. So the response is going to come back in the headers, and you can access the headers to really look at some of the content. And, you know, just like file headers or packets header, it would have a lot of the details about the activities or the connection or the communication that's established. Okay. And coming from the last chapter socket until now, you start to see that, you know, in some library, we would have to open and then request and respond. Other library, we can just establish the request and respond, and then sometime we can also close too. Okay. The thing that I like about this book is that it's not giving you a lot of fluff. Like some other books, they will just have a lot of like fluff. You know, he was very direct with the content and some of the things that that would be relevant, like example and how the examples are used. Okay, so throughout the book, you would just simply have example, just like how I took it and I put it onto your notes, so that way you can see how the scripts are written. Now, the last part of this is going to be covered in the lab. On Wednesday, we're going to talk about how to be able to integrate the client server, and also looking at, you know, how to use request module. And, you know, so you can achieve pretty much what we've been talking about is download, image grabbing, and things like that with a different module. Now, bringing back all the other chapters up until now, we talked about how we can, you know, use Python to write, right? To look at your protocols, to look at, you know, to monitor your activity. We can also automate. You can use this to automate some of the things where you'll be able to automatically download certain things and open it up and access it. Okay. So let's take this to the perspective of how, you know, because there were some students that asked me some questions about in CIS27 the other day last week, and they were like, well, you know, we were talking about waterhole or websites that have, you know, malicious files, right? That would be scattered, and when people visit that, it automatically opens. You can definitely incorporate the concept that we talked about this week to that, right? So as the browser opens, okay, and the URL is input, it gets from that website, right? And so they simply build a script that once that website is responding, it's going to serve a file. And that file is then open and read, right? And if it's an executable file, we can have it run, right? Without the user being knowledgeable of that file. So from a malicious intention side, you can see that knowing how to be able to build these type of scripts, you can definitely do that, right? Or when we are looking from how we would be able to protect the resources and things like that from web servers and how to communicate. So ultimately, we already understand how to build the socket for the communication, how you can establish requests, and if the requests fail, how you can be able to handle that, how your data is coming through and how it's parsed. Okay. And then in the case if we're using like HTTP compared to HTTPS, we have to consider TLS aspect on that, right? and then how we can add in elements that elevate the security, like authentication using API. And so that's going to be part of our lab as well, is to incorporate API mechanism and use RESTful API. Yeah, chapter is fairly short. I put most of the content is that you see here is going to be for just your simple script and using some of the libraries. And then I'll add addition for the next part, which is going to be for our lab. Any question? Okay. So by Sunday, please make sure that we submit your assignment, which is fairly short, right? Question, answer, and screenshot. Okay. If you're missing anything, make sure that we put in. Yeah, so this is your, so when you're using a local host like this, that's just your machine, right? And so then on the server have to redirect to a malicious site. No, it could be that it is a website, right? Which is, it has a public IP. It is hosted by an entity, okay, which is connected to a DNS. And then on it, you know, you would have a script that would be ran when the user submit the GET. And it can be ran to open a file, right, that you store somewhere inside that web server, and then to be able to activate that file. Okay, so you simply download a file, right? So when the client connects, it automatically download the file and then open the file. And that can be done in Python scripting. So that malicious file, you just gotta store it into the directory where that script can be able to access it. So in the same folder. So when you investigate that, you have to go and look through the directories, and you can use URL lib, right? Request to be able to traverse or look through the directory to see what is in the directory for that particular domain or the domain extension. Any question? Other questions? Yeah, so you're using your local host that just make your computer a web server at home, but it's not publicly accessible, Michelle. In order to be publicly accessible, we gotta tie it to a public IP, right? And a DNS. So if you want to make your server accessible to everybody, you have to set up the DNS port, and you gotta include that 8080 port, right, on your router so it routes traffic into that system. So, and then we would have to network address translate it to a public IP. Yeah. So if you wanted to test it internally, you can, right? So on that web server, I would store some kind of file and then have it access that file, open that file and read it. And usually they would use some form of executable. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to stop recording.